On April 17, 1987, local authorities in Ridgefield County, Montana, received a concerning report about 16-year-old Sarah Jenkins, who had seemingly vanished without a trace from her high school. What initially appeared to be a typical teenage runaway case would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing investigations in American criminal history, exposing decades of hidden abuse on an isolated farm. Sarah Jenkins was described by her teachers as a quiet, intelligent student who had recently transferred to Ridgefield High School just 3 months prior. According to school records, she had been homeschooled for most of her life before her unexpected enrollment. The teenager lived with her uncle, James Turner, in a small house at the edge of town, though interactions between Sarah and the community had been minimal at best. The morning of her disappearance began like any other spring day in Montana. Weather reports indicated clear skies with temperatures around 58 degrees. Sarah attended her first 2 classes as scheduled, but never appeared for third-period mathematics. Her backpack and jacket were found in her locker, suggesting she hadn't planned to leave the premises. Security cameras captured her walking toward the east exit at 10:17 a.m., but no footage showed her actually leaving the building. Initial search efforts focused on the immediate vicinity of the school. Local police, assisted by volunteer search parties, combed through the surrounding woods, abandoned buildings, and nearby creek beds. Tracking dogs picked up Sarah's scent, leading toward the highway before losing it completely, suggesting she might have entered a vehicle. However, no witnesses reported seeing her leave with anyone. James Turner, Sarah's supposed uncle, appeared appropriately distressed during initial questioning. He claimed to have no knowledge of Sarah's whereabouts and explained that he had become her guardian after the death of her parents in a house fire 3 years earlier. Turner provided documentation that appeared legitimate at first glance and cooperated with investigators, even allowing them to search his modest home without a warrant. "Sarah's a good girl," Turner told investigators. "She wouldn't just run off. Something must have happened to her." His concern seemed genuine, which initially directed suspicion away from him. What struck investigators as unusual, however, was the near-complete absence of personal belongings in Sarah's room. No photographs, mementos, or personal journals could be found. Her clothing consisted of just a few plain items, and there were no electronics, books, or typical teenage possessions. When questioned about this, Turner explained that most of their belongings had been lost in the fire that killed Sarah's parents, and they lived a simple life by choice. As days turned into weeks with no sign of Sarah, authorities expanded their investigation. They discovered that very little information existed about Sarah's past. Her school records prior to Ridgefield were sparse and inconsistent. More troublingly, investigators could find no death certificates matching the names Turner had provided for Sarah's parents. The breakthrough came when a state trooper recognized Turner's name from an old report. In 1979, authorities in neighboring Idaho had investigated complaints about a remote farm where children were allegedly being kept in isolation. The investigation had been inconclusive, but the property was registered to a Samuel Turner, James Turner's father. This connection led investigators to the Turner Farm, an isolated 320-acre property nestled in the mountains of western Montana, nearly 70 miles from Ridgefield. The farm had been in the Turner family since the late 1950s, when Samuel Turner, then 35, purchased the land and moved there with his young wife and first 2 children. Public records showed that Samuel had gradually acquired adjacent parcels of land over the decades, expanding the property and increasing its isolation. What concerned investigators most was the realization that the Turner farm existed in a jurisdictional gray area between county lines, and its remote location meant that it had rarely been visited by authorities. A preliminary background check revealed that Samuel Turner was now 82 years old and had no record of employment outside the farm for over 40 years. Yet property taxes had been paid regularly, and occasional supply runs to distant towns were the only contact the family appeared to have with the outside world. The disappearance of Sarah Jenkins now took on a new dimension. Was she truly missing, or had she simply returned to the farm? And why had she been enrolled in public school after years of isolation, only to disappear months later? These questions would drive the investigation forward, though no one could have predicted the horrifying answers that would eventually emerge. If you want to follow more cases like this that shake entire communities and reveal hidden truths, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. On May 23, 1987, armed with search warrants, a joint task force of FBI agents, state police, and local law enforcement approached the Turner farm. The property was surrounded by dense forest with a single dirt road leading to the main compound. Satellite imagery had revealed multiple structures scattered across the property: a main farmhouse, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be smaller cabins partially hidden by the tree line. As authorities made their way down the winding mountain road, they were struck by the strategic positioning of the property. The farm sat in a natural valley, invisible from public roads and protected by the surrounding mountains. Radio communication became increasingly difficult as they descended, creating an eerie sense of isolation that would have made outside contact nearly impossible for anyone living there. Upon arrival, officers found the main gate locked with multiple warning signs about trespassing and private property. After announcing their presence and receiving no response, they breached the gate and proceeded toward the main farmhouse. The scene they encountered was disturbing in its normalcy. A well-maintained property with gardens, livestock, and signs of active habitation, yet completely deserted of people. "It was like they knew we were coming," recalled FBI Special Agent Marcus Dawson in later testimony. Beds were made, food was in the refrigerator, clothes hung in closets, but not a single person was present. A methodical search of the main house revealed living quarters for multiple individuals, though the exact number remained unclear. Investigators discovered a room they believed belonged to Sarah Jenkins, containing the same type of plain clothing found in her room in Ridgefield. More troublingly, they found prescription medication labeled with her name, but a different birth date than what appeared on her school records. In a locked office in the main house, investigators uncovered the first concrete evidence of wrongdoing: meticulously maintained ledgers dating back to 1958, documenting the farm's operations, finances, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be a record of births, deaths, and what Samuel Turner called family pairings. The ledgers revealed that after purchasing the property in 1958, Samuel Turner had gradually cut ties with the outside world. His wife, Margaret, had given birth to 7 children between 1953 and 1967, all born on the farm, without medical assistance. As these children reached adolescence, the ledgers documented unions between siblings, with subsequent births of a second generation. By the 1980s, a third generation had begun, with over 30 individuals living on the property, all descendants of Samuel and Margaret Turner. The level of detail in these records was chilling, said prosecutor Diana Mitchell during later court proceedings. Turner tracked bloodlines, fertility cycles, and even genetic traits like he was conducting a human breeding experiment. The investigation took a darker turn when cadaver dogs were brought to the property and alerted to multiple locations in the surrounding woods. Excavations revealed a family cemetery containing 14 marked graves, most with wooden markers bearing only initials and dates. Forensic teams began the grim task of exhuming and identifying the remains, a process complicated by the lack of dental records or official documentation for most of the deceased. While the search of the property continued, authorities launched a nationwide manhunt for Samuel Turner and the missing family members. They discovered that James Turner, the man who had posed as Sarah's uncle in Ridgefield, was actually Samuel's oldest son, born in 1953. Financial records showed that the farm had been largely self-sufficient, with income derived from selling organic produce and handcrafted items at distant markets, always in cash transactions. Investigators faced significant challenges in reconstructing the family tree and identifying potential victims. With no school records, medical histories, or social security numbers for most family members, they relied heavily on the ledgers and DNA testing. The genetic analysis confirmed their worst fears. Multiple generations of inbreeding had occurred, resulting in children born from parent-child and sibling relationships. The breakthrough in locating the missing family came from an unexpected source. On June 12, 1987, a highway patrol officer in eastern Wyoming stopped a convoy of 3 vehicles for a broken taillight. The occupants, consisting of an elderly man, several adults, and numerous children, presented identification papers that raised the officer's suspicions. After running their information through the system, he realized he had encountered the Turner family. Samuel Turner and 17 family members were taken into custody, while an additional 11 children, were placed in emergency protective services. Among them was Sarah Jenkins, whose real name was determined to be Emma Turner, a third-generation member of the family. At 16, she had been selected by Samuel to venture into the outside world as part of what he called the Renewal Project, an apparent attempt to introduce limited, fresh genetic material into the family line. As investigators pieced together statements from family members, a complex picture emerged of life on the Turner farm. Many of the younger generation had never left the property and had been raised to believe that the outside world was dangerous and immoral. They had been taught modified versions of religious texts that justified their isolated lifestyle and the family unions imposed by Samuel. The most shocking element of the investigation was the discovery that many family members did not perceive their situation as abuse. Years of isolation and indoctrination had normalized their circumstances, creating a closed system of beliefs that would prove extremely difficult to unravel as the case moved toward prosecution. By September 1987, as autumn painted the Montana forests in shades of gold and crimson, the investigation into the Turner case had expanded into one of the largest and most complex FBI operations in the region's history. The discoveries made during this phase would fundamentally alter understanding of the case and reveal the true extent of Samuel Turner's control over his expanding family. Forensic analysis of the exhumed remains from the family cemetery revealed a disturbing pattern. Of the 14 bodies recovered, 8 were children under the age of 5, and 3 were women who had died during childbirth. DNA testing confirmed that all were members of the Turner family, with genetic markers indicating advanced consanguinity. Medical examiners determined that most of the infant deaths could have been prevented with basic medical care, which Samuel had consistently refused to seek. The infant mortality rate on that farm was comparable to pre-industrial levels, noted Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the case. The combination of genetic complications from inbreeding and the absence of medical intervention created a deadly environment, particularly for mothers and newborns. The testimonies of family members, especially those of the second and third generations, painted a picture of life under Samuel Turner's absolute control. Daily routines were strictly regimented, with work assignments, mealtimes, and even personal relationships dictated by the family patriarch. Education consisted solely of practical skills needed for farm operations and religious instruction heavily modified by Samuel to reinforce his authority. Perhaps the most shocking revelation came from the discovery of Samuel's private journals, hidden in a concealed compartment beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. These writings, dating back to 1955, revealed that the isolation of the Turner family had not been a reaction to perceived societal corruption, as he had claimed to his family, but rather a premeditated plan to create what he called the perfect lineage. In entries from 1954 and 1955, before purchasing the Montana property, Samuel wrote extensively about his fascination with selective breeding and genetic purity. References to discredited eugenics theories and obscure religious texts filled these early journals, alongside detailed plans for establishing a self-sufficient community isolated from outside influence. "The world dilutes perfection," he wrote in 1955. "Only through careful selection and preservation of our bloodline can we achieve the higher form that God intended. Within 3 generations, the transformation will begin." This ideological foundation explained the meticulous record-keeping discovered earlier. Samuel wasn't simply tracking family relationships, he was documenting what he perceived as a grand genetic experiment spanning decades. The ledgers contained detailed observations of physical characteristics, intellectual capabilities, and behavioral traits of each family member, which informed his decisions about pairings and reproduction. Further investigation into Samuel's background revealed that before establishing the farm, he had briefly worked as a laboratory assistant at a university genetics department in the early 1950s. Though he had no formal education beyond high school, this exposure apparently influenced his distorted understanding of genetic inheritance and evolution. Emma Turner, previously known as Sarah Jenkins, provided crucial testimony after months of psychological counseling. As one of the few family members who had been permitted limited contact with the outside world, her perspective bridged the gap between the isolated farm community and broader society. She revealed that her placement in Ridgefield High School had been part of Samuel's plan to eventually introduce selected outsiders to the family for genetic diversity, but under strictly controlled conditions. Grandfather said the family needed new blood, but only the right kind, Emma stated in her deposition. I was supposed to identify potential candidates who matched his criteria and bring them back during school breaks for his approval. Her disappearance from school had occurred after she began forming friendships that Samuel hadn't anticipated. When James reported this to his father during a scheduled call, Samuel ordered Emma's immediate return to the farm. The hasty extraction had triggered the missing person investigation that ultimately exposed the entire operation. As investigators continued interviewing family members, they discovered varying degrees of complicity and victimization. The oldest children of Samuel and Margaret, now in their 30s, appeared to function as enforcers of Samuel's will, having been indoctrinated from birth. The younger generations, particularly those under 20, displayed signs of complex trauma, educational deficits, and social developmental issues consistent with severe isolation and abuse. Margaret Turner, Samuel's wife and the matriarch of the family, emerged as perhaps the most tragic figure in the case. Medical examination revealed that she had endured multiple pregnancies under dangerous conditions, suffering untreated complications that had left her physically debilitated. Psychological evaluation suggested that decades of isolation and control had rendered her completely dependent on Samuel to the point where she could no longer distinguish between his will and her own. By December 1987, authorities had identified a total of 41 living Turner family members across 3 generations, all descended from Samuel and Margaret. The complex web of relationships, biological, psychological, and social, presented unprecedented challenges for the legal system, social services, and medical professionals involved in the case. Leave in the comments, never give up on the truth if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found. The trial of Samuel Turner began on March 15, 1988, at the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana. The 83-year-old patriarch faced 126 charges, including kidnapping, child abuse, false imprisonment, identity fraud, and multiple violations of civil rights laws. The legal proceedings would last nearly 7 months, becoming one of the longest and most complex cases in the state's history. Prosecutors faced numerous challenges in presenting their case. Many family members were deemed psychologically unable to testify due to their lifelong isolation and indoctrination. Those who could appear in court often provided contradictory statements, with some defending Samuel's actions while others recounted horrific abuses. The legal team had to rely heavily on physical evidence, the meticulous records kept by Samuel himself, and expert testimony from psychologists specializing in cult dynamics and coercive control. Samuel Turner remained defiant throughout the proceedings. Representing himself, despite the court's repeated recommendations to accept legal counsel, he maintained that his actions were protected under religious freedom and parental rights. His courtroom statements revealed the depth of his ideological convictions and the extent of his detachment from societal norms. "What you call abuse, I call purification," he stated during cross-examination. "What you call imprisonment, I call protection. The world you've created is the true prison, contaminated by weakness and disorder. I sought only to preserve what God intended for humanity." On October 27, 1988, after 4 weeks of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on 119 of the 126 charges. Samuel Turner was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, Judge Caroline Meredith described the case as a horrific perversion of familial bonds and religious principles that resulted in generational trauma of an unprecedented nature. James Turner and 4 other adult children received lesser sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years for their roles in maintaining the family's isolation and enforcing Samuel's directives. Margaret Turner was ultimately deemed unfit to stand trial due to her severe psychological dependency and deteriorating physical health. She was committed to a specialized care facility where she would remain until her death in 1995, never fully comprehending the criminal nature of the family's lifestyle. The aftermath of the case presented enormous challenges for the younger Turner family members. Child welfare services faced the unprecedented task of rehabilitating and reintegrating 27 children and adolescents who had never known life outside the farm. Traditional foster care proved inadequate for addressing their unique needs, leading to the creation of a specialized rehabilitation program that combined education, therapy, and gradual exposure to mainstream society. Emma Turner, whose disappearance had initiated the investigation, became a key figure in this rehabilitation process. Having experienced both the isolated farm life and brief exposure to the outside world, she helped younger family members navigate their transition. After receiving extensive education and counseling, Emma eventually earned a degree in psychology and established a foundation dedicated to helping victims of similar isolated abuse situations. The Turner farm itself became the subject of extensive forensic investigation that continued for years after the trial. In total, researchers identified the remains of 23 individuals buried across the property, including 9 previously undiscovered graves. Genetic testing confirmed that all were Turner family members who had died between 1960 and 1986, primarily due to complications related to inbreeding and lack of medical care. The case led to significant legal reforms, particularly regarding monitoring of isolated communities and homeschooling oversight. Montana and several neighboring states implemented stricter requirements for families choosing to educate children outside the public school system, including regular health checks and academic assessments. Additionally, cross-jurisdictional protocols were established to prevent similar situations from falling through administrative cracks due to property locations on county or state borders. In the decades following the case, several Turner family members chose to share their experiences publicly, contributing valuable insights to psychological research on closed communities, indoctrination, and recovery from prolonged trauma. Their testimonies revealed both the devastating consequences of Samuel's experiment and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in overcoming such profound abuse. Samuel Turner died in federal prison on January 12, 2001, at the age of 96, never expressing remorse for his actions. His death marked the end of a dark chapter for the survivors, many of whom had spent years in therapy processing their experiences and building new lives. For most, the journey toward psychological recovery would be lifelong, with intergenerational effects continuing to manifest in complex ways. The case of the Turner farm stands as one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse in American criminal history. It demonstrates how isolation, manipulated religious beliefs, and absolute authority can create closed systems where unimaginable abuses become normalized across generations. Yet it also highlights the effectiveness of multidisciplinary approaches to investigation and rehabilitation when dealing with cases of extreme family pathology. Today, a memorial dedicated to the deceased Turner family members stands near the former farm property, which was eventually reclaimed by the state and converted into a wildlife preserve. The simple stone monument bears no names, only the inscription, "For those who lived and died in darkness, may truth and memory bring light." If you watched until here, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really cares about the search for truth. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates thoughtful investigations into cases that challenge our understanding of human behavior. Subscribe to see more documentaries that explore the depths of true crime while honoring the victims and seeking justice.